Hey guys, welcome to another video here on the AviationPro channel. It's time for another VATSIM tutorial, and as you know, in last week's video we covered climbs and departures on the VATSIM network. Now in this video we're going to take a look at descents and arrivals. And just like the climb phase, the descent phase can be quite stressful because it's kind of difficult to anticipate what you can expect for your arrival. Because even if you prepare well, for example, by knowing the active runway and knowing what star to fly, there are many situations where you deviate from your route and your entire plan that you made beforehand is kind of going out of whack. So in this video we're going to cover descent procedures and arrival procedures and taking a look at the different stuff that may happen during the descent. To that we'll add some ATC phraseology so you really get used to the situations that you may find yourself in during an arrival on the VATSIM network. Just like last week, first a few points that you have to keep in mind when you're doing your descents and arrivals on VATSIM. The first thing that you have to do is make sure that you plan ahead and prepare different scenarios. Now, as I said before, when you're planning an arrival and with an arrival runway and a star, things will go differently. So it's good that you plan ahead so you kind of have a sense what's going on at the airport and what route you may expect. Also make sure that you keep in your mind other scenarios and make sure that as part of your arrival briefing you really give a good overview of the possible scenarios that may happen based off the weather or maybe based off the traffic, so you know how to deal with that situation. Just as an example, let's say there's a straight perpendicular crosswind on your arrival runway, then it does make sense to also look at the arrival procedure for the other runway, because you never know if the wind is going to change in such a way that actually the other runway is going to become active. The second thing to keep in mind is that the arrival and the descent procedure is really a huge interplay between other traffic and air traffic control. Now on VATSIM you might encounter situations where you're flying by yourself on Unicom and you kind of have to keep an eye on the traffic while you're flying your star and your arrival procedure. But as soon as there's ATC and a bit more traffic comes up, it really becomes an interesting situation. And because it is such an interplay between all the air traffic control and traffic, make sure that you help each other wherever necessary. And I mean helping by adhering to restrictions and making sure that you are able to follow the ATC instructions properly, and just make sure that you make sense of the traffic situation so that the instructions from air traffic control make more sense and that you're able to take action when things are going wrong. Alright, so make sure that you really understand this interplay. And the third point to keep in mind is that the ultimate goal of a descent is to let the descent go as smoothly as possible. Now this does not only mean that you have to be able to follow your star and follow the vectoring instructions by ATC, but also that your glide path is nice and smooth as possible, because you don't want to level off each and every time and kind of burn a lot more virtual fuel than necessary. So make sure that you understand how your aircraft works, make sure that you understand what the different modes of automation do, so that depending on the situation you can play around with those different modes of automation and pick the best mode of descent as suits the situation. Now without further ado, let's head into the cockpit. I'm going to be simulating an arrival at Prague airport, airport that I also featured during the climb tutorial. This time I'm not featuring two arrivals because it's already quite a lengthy video. Now by all means, this footage that you're gonna see is not the perfect arrival because I'll also have to explain and I'll kind of act as air traffic controller at the same time. That's really not that easy. So this footage is really there to just make you aware of the different situations that may occur, to make you aware of the phraseology that you have to use, and kind of make you aware of what the different modes of automation best suit which situation. And trust me, practicing an arrival offline just following a full star using LNAV and VNAV, it's not very realistic. It's not what's going to happen on VATSIM as soon as there is air traffic control and a lot of traffic. So make sure you keep that in mind. So let's head into the cockpit and find out.
So hey guys, welcome into the Boeing 737 cockpit. As you can see, we're cruising along, flying from Amsterdam to Prague, and soon we're going to be preparing our arrival, and we're just going to go through this step by step. I'm going to show you the way I usually do this. You want to start preparing your arrival and approach kind of at least 15 minutes in advance before your top of descent. And again, preparation is key, so we're going to take it step by step. We're just going to open up the standard terminal arrival route chart. That's where we're going to look at first, because we want to prepare and take a look at in advance what kind of route we can expect for the runway we're going to. Now of course you would listen to the ATIS, make sure that you know the active runway so you know what runway to aim for, and you know the last waypoint on your flight plan. In this case our last waypoint is Golop, and we're going to be flying to runway 24 based off the weather conditions, and for that reason we're going to be flying the Golub to Shera arrival at Prague. So we're going to take a look at that chart. Okay, so as you can see, we have here the chart in front of us. Again, just take it step by step, make sure you read it through well, make sure that you know what you're doing. Alright, so we really want to enter all this information into the flight management computer, and you know, each and every aircraft has some sort of departure or arrival page where you can select different arrivals depending on the route that you're flying. In this case, we're flying at least the ILS to runway 24. Whatever approach you use doesn't really matter, but most often you will be flying ILS, and then you also select the star. So as you can see, Golub to Shera arrival. We have a speed restriction unless otherwise instructed, max 215 knots at speed limit point 1, or if flying off route at 28 dB Oscar Kilo Lima, max 220 knots at speed limit point 2. If unable to comply, advise ATC immediately. Okay, so there are apparently different speed limit points on this star, so we have to take that into account. So as you can see, we have here Golub, and it's already speed limit point 1 in this case, maximum 250 knots. And then we're going to fly to Papa Romeo 516, Papa Romeo 517, speed maximum 220 knots. Then Papa Romeo 518, and then a left turn to Erasu. And from there on, we are going to continue with the approach. So if we look now at the approach chart for runway 24, we can see indeed that continues with Erasu, Papa Romeo 531, 532, and then we're going to fly inbound to the ILS. Okay, so that's kind of a general idea of this approach. There's a wide variety of standard terminal arrival routes and how they are structured and how many restrictions you'll be finding there. So keep that in mind. In this case, this particular star, there are not a lot of restrictions. There are only particular speed restrictions. So we're going to take a look in a minute in the FMC whether those restrictions are in there. Now, if there are a lot of altitude restrictions on your route and speed restrictions, for example, flying into Gatwick, which is a totally different star with a lot of restrictions, make sure that you check out in the FMC whether the restrictions are all in there. And you know, the best method to use is probably VNAV. So you really, you know, let the aircraft calculate its own profile so it can descend using all those restrictions. Kind of the same as during the climb procedure, but then the other way around, right? So in this case, I'm going to select ILS runway 24, Golub to Shera arrival, and then the transition Erasu. So I'm going to execute for now, and make sure that you check out this route and the restrictions again. Okay, so I'm just going to go into plan mode, and we're going to step through the different waypoints. Well, the restriction of 250 knots at Golub is in there. And then we have all the different Papa Romeo waypoints. In this case, 220 knots at Papa Romeo 517 is in there as well. So that looks all good. Again, with each and every star it's going to look different. So on some stars they're going to be a hard altitude restriction, some there, or flying you know, at a particular altitude at a certain waypoint, or above or below a certain waypoint. So make sure that you cross-check with the chart what those restrictions look like. Now, one important thing here, so as you can see, there's a certain vector, and if you look at the chart for the approach, as you can see there's a little box saying unless otherwise instructed, continue on 061 degree heading, radar vectoring will be provided. Alright, so that is very important to remember. So you cannot just, you know, fly the transition right here to ILS runway 24, so from Erasu to Papa Romeo 531. Actually, there is a vector right there. So keep in mind that you cannot just make that right turn and join the approach. You know, we really have to wait from clearance from ATC, and you can expect vectors. This is the point where air traffic controller will simply give you, you know, certain heading or a speed limit, and it gives you altitude instructions in order to get you to the approach. Okay, keep in mind that that vector is in there. For now, I'm going to delete it, and the reason why I'm doing this is because I want my VNAV path to be calculated as accurately as possible to what I expect personally. That's the way I usually do it. Of course, you can also leave the restrictions in there, but as long as you remember those restrictions and take a good look at the chart, you can kind of play around with the route in order to get a more accurate calculation of your descent path. So I'm simply going to delete this vector. I'm going to be flying directly to Erasu. So we're just going to pretend we're actually going to fly the transition, okay, for now, which gives a more accurate representation of what the actual flight path probably will look like. You know, this is kind of based on past experience with this airport. You kind of know what to do, but keep in mind that, you know, you can kind of play around with this in order to calculate your profile a bit better. Make sure you plan that arrival. Make sure to take a good look at the charts at what the situation is like, and make sure you kind of generate a route for yourself. You know, even if there's no ATC, make sure you kind of generate a route for yourself so you can really calculate sort of continuous descent path. Of course, you can also do some nice mental calculations. There's a great video by Captain Joe featuring some mental calculations that you can do, very easily in order to determine when you need to descend. But it's kind of a cheat method that also allows you to really calculate a nice continuous descent using the VNAV function. Alright, so now that we have a good overview of the star and that what we can expect, we're also going to take a look at the final approach to runway 24 in this case. Well, we have an inbound course at 241, we're just going to fly the ILS approach. You want to make sure that you tune the navigation radios, make sure that's all in there. Make sure that you give the misapproach procedure a good review so that when ATC tells you to go around that you have a good idea what to do. And of course you also want to enter the minimums right here. For example, for a Cat 1 approach, this would be 1358 feet above sea level or 200 feet above ground level. Okay, so I'm just going to set all that information now. So 241 inbound course, 241, there we go. And the frequency was 109.1, so I'm just going to put it in my navigation radio. There we go. And the minimums were 1358 feet, so I'm going to set that here using this barrow knob. As you can see, that has now been set. Now make sure that you also have a good understanding of the weather situation. This is of course a really important part of your, kind of your pre-flight stuff. When you're going through the flight plan, make sure that you know if it's actually safe to fly to the airport, and you can already kind of anticipate what runway to expect. But also, before you descend, make sure you give the ATIS a review, or at least a METAR, so you have an idea what's going on at the airport. Okay, in this case I have the METAR for Prague. As you can see, the winds are 170 degrees 7 knots, so we're going to have a nice crosswind upon landing. Clouds and visibility okay, so CAF okay, temperature is 5, dew point is 1. QNH is 1014 and there's no significant change expected. Okay, so I can already in this aircraft put the QNH on the standby 1014. Now if you remember from the climb tutorial, we were passing a certain transition altitude at which we switched from the local QNH to the standard QNH. Now on the descent it's actually exactly the opposite. We're going to be passing now a so-called transition level to which we're going to switch from the standard QNH 1013 to the local QNH, and the local QNH is in this case 1014. In Europe, at every airport you have to listen to the ATIS in order to get to know the transition level. It's determined by ATC, so you will not find it on a chart. If you're flying in the US, transition level, flight level 180 is standard, just like 18,000 feet is the standard transition altitude. Flight level 180 is the standard transition level. So that's a much higher altitude at which you switch to the local QNH. So in our case we would have to listen to the ATIS. So if there's ATIS online on VATSIM, you can just listen for it. So we can pretend, okay, maybe the transition level today is flight level 80. So we can just put that in here in the forecast page of this aircraft, 080. There we go. Now, if there's no ATC online, you kind of have to guess yourself. Just pick a random altitude. You could also just pick the transition altitude, but at least, make sure that you're flying on the local QNH when you're joining the approach to the runway, because that's of course really the stage at which you really want to make sure that you're flying at the correct altitude. Alright, so as you can see, top of descent is now coming up in about 20 nautical miles, and right here we also have an estimation at 9:32 Zulu, so in about 2 minutes. Now, ATC might clear you to descend already. In that case, in some aircraft you also have a descend now function, so you can already descend using the VNAV function. And again, depending on how you've programmed your star and whether you created some shortcuts for yourself, this top of descent is going to switch position. So really make sure that you plan ahead here, and make sure that you really go through all the waypoints so you can determine what's the best point to descend using the automation in this case. So we're really approaching our top of descent in 1 minute right now. At some point you will see the aircraft giving a warning that you have to reset your MCP altitude, because the aircraft wants to descend based off the top of descent. Now when the ATC has not given you clearance yet, you can simply request for a descent. Okay, so now we're Munich radar, and soon we'll be entering Prague radar. So in this case we're already descending in another region. Again, just because you're flying to Prague doesn't mean that you're going to be requesting descent at Prague radar. You may already descend earlier than that. So as you can see, reset MCP altitude, so let's request descent from Munich radar. And KLM 55 Tango, request descent. KLM 55 Tango, descent flight level 250. Descent flight level 250, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, we've received a new altitude, 250, so we're just going to put it in there. And in this case, we can just wait for the top of the descent to come up. As you can see, we're approaching it within a couple of seconds, and the aircraft will start descending on the profile that it has calculated itself. So as you can see, the descent is now initiated. Flying a star, you know, and flying an arrival and a descent is really just constantly keep monitoring your vertical profile and your lateral profile, and make sure that you kind of update yourself to see what's going on. As you can see, we have quite a lot of tailwinds, so that means that we're also going to have to, you know, take into account that reducing our speed will require us to fly a couple more miles. But we've now initiated the descent, and we're just going to keep monitoring the situation. Now, if you remember from the climb tutorial, there can be situations where there's traffic in your way, which requires you to climb faster, right? Now, this can also happen on the descent, which ATC will require you to descend faster. So let's say that happens right now. Let's say ATC wants us to descend faster to flight level 200 because of traffic, and that will sound something like this. KLM 55 Tango, descent flight level 200, expedite descent. Descent flight level 200, expedite descent, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, so we're gonna enter flight level 200. So what do you do in this case? Well, again, you really need to kind of know your aircraft, kind of see the options. You don't really have to slam out the speed brake immediately. What you can also do in this case, we're going to use the speed intervent function of the aircraft, and simply, you know, kind of try to increase the speed as much as possible. This will simply increase the rate of descent, as you can see, quite substantially. All right, the aircraft will kind of just dive in order to, you know, make sure that we're going to be descending fast enough in order to reach the speed. Okay, so I can kind of control that manually adjust the speed, and if necessary, you can also, you know, put out the speed brakes. This is going to, you know, dump the lift over the wings, allowing you to descend even faster. But you know, it's not really comfortable for the passengers, and you kind of want to avoid the speed brake as much as possible. So if this is okay, you know, if ATC instructs you to descend even faster, you know, then you could also use it. But you know, in the meantime, this is just a good way to manage the increased rate of descent. We're facing a different situation here, right? We're descending a lot faster than we planned to. So as you can see, right now we're really, you know, descending quite below our profile. So you really want to keep monitoring again, make sure that everything is okay. You know, kind of try to rejoin the profile later on by simply descending a little bit shallower. Okay, so let's say ATC instructs us now that we're now clear of the traffic. We can resume our, you know, kind of original rate of descent. We can just let the VNAV do the work here for now. And as you can see, it's now going to descend at a more economical speed, and we're kind of catching up with our pre-calculated profile. Okay, so you can just keep monitoring the situation. Okay, so what we can expect right now is soon we'll be transitioning to Praha radar, and Praha radar will probably clear us for a particular arrival. Now, we already know that we're going to be flying a Golub to Shera arrival based off the runway that's currently active at Prague. Depending on how the star looks, you're going to get different clearances, okay? I just want to review these clearances a little bit before we fly into Prague.
Let's take a look, for example, at this arrival at Gatwick. Let's suppose we're flying the Tebra 1 Golf arrival, and as you can see on this star there are a lot of restrictions. For example, at Uptum we have to be at flight level 140, and then we have to fly several speed restrictions at, for example, Kilo Kilo Echo 63 and Lark, and then we have to arrive at Timba at flight level 70. So you want to make sure that you cross-check in the FMC, and if it's not there, enter any of these restrictions so that you are absolutely sure that when you're using the VNAV function, the aircraft will follow the profile accordingly and you'll meet the restrictions. Now, an associated clearance might sound something like this. For example, KLM 55 Tango, clear Tebra 1 Golf arrival, descend via the star to flight level 70. And this basically means that you have to follow all the restrictions as published on the standard terminal arrival route chart, and that you can descend to flight level 70 to reach Timba. Okay, so make sure that you are aware of such instruction, and by making sure that these restrictions are actually in the flight management system and in the VNAV path, you make sure that your top of descent is more accurate, because represents better what the route will look like, during the arrival. So let's take a look at one more example. As you can see, we have here the arrival at Amsterdam. Let's say we're flying the Norco to Alpha arrival. As you can see, there's already a restriction where we have to fly between different flight levels at Norco, and then we can continue to RTIP. Now, for example, an air traffic controller might not specifically say that you have to descend via the star, but simply gives you a restriction at a particular waypoint. For example, KLM 55 Tango, cleared Norco to Alpha arrival, descend flight level 100 level by RTIP. And that basically means that you have to be leveled at the RTIP waypoint at flight level 100. Or something like this, KLM 55 Tango, cleared Norco to Alpha arrival, descend flight level 70, cross RTIP flight level 100 or below. As you can see, that's a little bit of a different instruction. So the ATC might really specify, as you would see on the charts, that you have to fly above or below a certain waypoint. So just make sure that you're aware again of such instruction, that you may get a restriction at a particular waypoint. Then any other restriction at the star don't really matter anymore, as long as you meet the restriction at that particular waypoint, because usually a waypoint like that, like RTIP in this case, is the point where you're going to be vectored. So ATC just wants to make sure that you're flying at a particular altitude, so you can get vectored easily to the approach to the runway.
Again, 55 Tango, descend flight level 150, contact radar on 120.72, bye bye. Descend flight level 150, contact radar 120.72, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, so we're going to the next frequency, 120.72, there we go, and we're going to contact radar. Radar, good afternoon, KLM 55 Tango, inbound Golop, passing flight level 205 for flight level 150. KLM 55 Tango, radar contact. Cleared Golop to Sierra arrival, descent flight level 100. Cleared Golop to Sierra arrival, descent flight level 100, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, so we've now received a new altitude instruction, flight level 100. So we're just going to set it like that. And we've been cleared for the actual arrival. Now, this particular arrival, unlike the one we kind of reviewed just before from Gatwick, does not really have any altitude restrictions, but the speed restrictions you really want to adhere to, those are really there to really manage the traffic, but there are no particular altitude restrictions, so we just can use the VNAV function to fly via our calculated path. Okay, I'm just going to keep monitoring the situation, and as you can see, the aircraft may ask for a little bit of drag depending on whether you are flying too fast in order to meet the restrictions, so make sure you keep an eye on that. If necessary, you can always kind of switch to one of the more manual modes, so you really adhere to the speed restriction, because again, VNAV will not always be perfect, so keep that in mind. So in this case, I'm just going to intervene a little bit, kind of reduce the speed to 250, so we really meet that speed restriction at Golop. Because if you're cleared for an arrival and the air traffic controller does not give you any specific speed instructions, you will still have to kind of adhere to the speed restrictions as they are on the star. Okay, if you received a descent clearance without mentioning that you have to descend via the star, then you can just ignore the altitude restrictions, but the speed restrictions are good to kind of keep following. Okay, so keep that in mind. So I'm just now kind of early on kind of reducing my speed right here, so I make sure that we really arrive at that speed properly. Again, altitude is not a big factor right here on this particular star, but speed is, so make sure that you keep that in mind. As you can see, 250 knots. We're now a bit higher than the calculated profile, but it's okay, we can probably catch up. Again, just keep monitoring the situation. And if you're not able to catch up, and if it turns out that you're too high on approach, you can always ask ATC for delay vectors, and this will allow you to fly a little bit longer downwind, for example, so that you have more time to descend the aircraft. Okay, so keep in mind that you can make such requests. Now again, I'm just aligning the heading buck, because we can always expect some sort of vectors at this stage, so keep that in mind. But for now, we're just going to follow the arrival as cleared. Again, 55 Tango, contact Prague radar 120.52. Bye bye. 120.52, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, so we're now going to the next frequency, Prague radar. In this case, is kind of the approach controller, and the approach controller is really the controller that will probably provide vectors. Okay, so we're just going to contact that controller. And Prague radar, good afternoon, KLM 55 Tango, flight level 133, Golop to Sierra arrival. KLM 55 Tango, Prague radar, radar contact to descent flight level 80. Descent flight level 80, KLM 55 Tango. Alright, we have a new altitude. As you can see, it's still flight level because we're now kind of flying on the transition level. And we've not received any further instructions, so we're just going to follow the star, including the speed restrictions. Again, we're a little bit high on profile, but I expect we can catch up later on. You know, the air traffic controller kind of also knows, based off your altitude, you know, how long your vectors will be. Okay, so just keep managing the situation and make sure you have a nice continuous descent as possible.
Again, 55 Tango, vectors for ILS approach runway 24, turn left heading 100.
Left heading 100, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, so in this case we're going to get vectored, so I'm just going to select the heading 100. And we're going to now be deviating from our lateral path, right? So what you can do, just like on the climb, is kind of update the VNAV as much as possible, because we're now being vectored, so we're not going to be following a particular arrival anymore. So we're just going to direct to Erasu, for example. This kind of gives us an estimate of our descent path. Now, in this case, it says the descent path is unachievable, but it could be due to traffic that you're simply ending up higher on the approach, and that there's still, for example, a lot of traffic on the downwind to the runway, right? It could happen, so make sure that you keep it in mind. Again, I'm not an air traffic controller at this particular airport, so I'm not fully aware of the procedures, but you know, it will all come together and you know, kind of become clear when you're actually flying on a VATSIM network, because it's really an interplay between air traffic control and other traffic again.
Again, 55 Tango, turn left heading 060, descent altitude 4,000 feet on QNH 1014, speed 220 knots.
Left heading 060, descent altitude 4,000 feet on QNH 1014, speed 220 knots, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, as you can see, a lot of instructions. You may get certain instructions like that. I'm now going to switch to a more manual way of flying, speed 220 knots, descending 4,000 feet and heading 060. So as you can see, we're kind of flying on the downwind leg to runway 24 right now, right? And this is one thing I forgot. Always make sure that you actually select a nice approach speed and a flap setting for your aircraft. So 30 degrees of flaps, 138 knots. So final approach speed will, with the wind correction, be 143 knots. So at this stage, what we can expect right now is probably just flying on the downwind leg until we kind of reach a point where we can turn towards the localizer. And again, depending on the amount of traffic, you may get such factors, and ATC might also give you track miles. And to explain track miles, we're going to take a look at my recent arrival at Gatwick, so we can kind of put that more into practice.
So during this arrival, I was being vectored around the Gatwick airport with a lot of air traffic and a lot of air traffic control, and it kind of shows you the perfect situation of the interplay between air traffic control and traffic. So make sure you check this video out. I think it's going to be really useful to kind of see how things are working. Now, as you can see, at some point the controller says that I have still 29 miles to go, 29 so-called track miles, and this is basically the amount of miles that the air traffic controller is going to be vectoring you. Now, as you can see, at this particular case I was at 7,000 feet. Now, if we do some quick mental calculations, as explained by Captain Joe in his descent video, you can kind of determine, okay, how much room do I have for this descent? So if we take a look at the 7,000 feet that we're flying, if we take the first two digits of that altitude and divide it by 3, as you can see, we still have 23 miles to cover. For example, if you would be flying at 12,000 feet, if we take the first 3 digits of that larger altitude, we would still need 40 miles. Now in this case, again, 23 miles, and that still leaves 6 miles room. Well, of course we need that room in order to reduce our speed. So for every nautical mile you can lose about 10 knots of airspeed. So basically, as you can see, we're flying at about 220 knots in this case. So basically, using this quick calculation, we can see that we can safely reduce to 160 knots while we're remaining on the profile. So if at any point you notice, for example, that you're simply too high, or you may need a little bit more drag, or you don't have enough room to reduce your speed based on the amount of track miles, you can create a little bit of drag, or maybe anticipate that during the ILS approach you may need to put the gear down a little bit earlier, or put the flaps out a little bit earlier, in order to make sure that you're able to reduce your speed. So as you can see, this is really helpful. Make sure you do these constant calculations based on what air traffic controller gives you. Of course, you can make use of the VNAV profile as well, and make sure that you update it, and make sure that you let the aircraft itself calculate the path constantly, so you kind of can see from the navigation display whether you're on track. But the mental calculations are definitely helpful when you're getting vectored.
Again, 55 Tango, turn right heading 210, cleared ILS approach runway 24.
Right heading 210, cleared ILS approach runway 24, get on 55 Tango. So as you can see, what the controller is now doing is really sending us around back to the ILS, and we're now cleared for the ILS approach. And being cleared for the ILS approach gets rid of all the previous restrictions that you may have had. So we now can manage our speed ourselves and also manage our altitude. Now, as you can see, I'm just going to update the arrival route once more, and we're just going to keep descending to 4,000. Now at this stage it's more economical probably to use something like vertical speed, because what the aircraft is now going to do on level change is simply using the speed of 220 knots to descend to 4,000, and then once you level off at 4,000 you're going to be capturing the glide slope, okay, later on. But you know, you could also kind of reduce your vertical speed in this case. For example, let's say just 700, because I think the glide slope will not be coming up yet. So I'm just going to arm the approach mode. As you can see, we're capturing the glide slope away from the low. So basically what you can do now is make sure that you fly a more gradual descent and kind of reduce your speed on the go, okay? So the way you manage your speed is really depending on your aircraft again, of course. And as a reference, here are some speed references depending on what your distance is from the runway. So make sure you keep those kind of speeds in mind, so you don't really fly too fast on the approach. That's not what you want, of course. As you can see, we're now flying a nice gradual descent. Localizer is coming up. As you can see, the localizer has now been captured, and while we await for the glide slope to come up, we're just going to keep on gradually descending and reducing our speed along the way. Okay, so as you can see, with this vertical speed we're doing quite nicely. We're still maintaining a kind of a high speed here, but that's okay. As you can see right now on the BFD it shows glide path. It thinks that we're going to fly an RNF approach, but that's not the case. So we'll have to keep monitoring this situation. As you can see, 4,000. I'm going to reduce my vertical speed even further. Okay, just for that glide slope to come up. In this case, for some reason it's picking up the glide path, I'm not sure. But we're going to do flaps 1 right now. And as you can see, again, the minimum flap speed right here, or flaps up. So by this time we really have to fly at flaps 1. Okay, so we can now kind of reduce your speed gradually. And as you can see, by flying vertical speed, we're kind of capturing the glide path without having to level off and increase the thrust again. Okay, so that's really a nice gradual way of descending. Okay, so at this stage I'm just going to steadily reduce to 160 knots, and you want to fly about 160 knots until 4 DME, after which you switch to the final approach speed. Okay, so I'm just entering 160. You can see the glide slope, or in this case glide path, is now captured, and we're now descending nicely. Okay, now if your speed is too high on approach, you can do things like putting the speed brakes down or get the gear down a little bit early. This creates a lot of drag, allowing you to really get rid of any excess speed. But as you can see, thanks to the use of vertical speed, we've now really made a gradual kind of intercept of the approach, right? So you can just keep monitoring that and make sure that you, again, just play around with the different modes of automation in order to really achieve the best descent path as possible. Okay, now I'm just going to reduce to 160. As you can see, that's kind of the minimum flap speed for flaps 5. So you want to put the gear down about 6 nautical miles from the runway, and as you can see right now we're flying about 7 nautical miles from the runway. So I'm just going to keep monitoring again, and whenever you feel like it, you can always, you know, switch to manual flying. Especially right now, for example, the visibility is really good, so I'm just going to switch to manual flying. And the next thing that you can expect, I'm going to put the gear down by the way in the meantime, and the flaps 15. The next thing that you can expect is a handoff to tower. Sometimes air traffic controller may ask you to call when you're established on the approach, on the ILS for example, and that basically means when both the localizer and the glide slopes have moved and you've really captured them, you can report to ATC, okay, established on the ILS runway 24. In this case, the air traffic controller is just going to transfer us.
And get a 55 Tango, contact tower on 134.55, bye-bye.
134.55, get a 55 Tango. Okay. So we're going to contact tower right now. In the meantime, I'm going to disconnect the automation so I can fly some nice and manually. There we go. Visibility is good, so that's okay. 4 nautical miles, so I'm just going to reduce to the final approach speed, 143. Get the flaps down to 30. There we go. And now we're going to report with tower. And Regina Tower, good afternoon, KLM 55 Tango, ILS runway 24.
KLM 55 Tango, Regina Tower, good day, wind 200 degrees, 15 knots, runway 24, clear to land.
Clear to land, runway 24, KLM 55 Tango. Okay, we've been cleared to land. Apparently there's no other traffic in front of us. Sometime you may hear something like your number 1 or number 2. Means there's still an aircraft on the runway or still an aircraft in front of you for the approach. So keep that in mind. Right now we're just going to nicely descend the aircraft further. And I'm just going to switch off the flight directors for fun. That's what you can do. I mean, we're just going to continue visually. We don't really need the indications anymore. So just based on your own preference, you can kind of play around with the different levels of automation again, right? And if the weather is good, feel free to hand fly, as long as you make sure that you know your position and are keeping in control of the aircraft, okay? My speed is a little bit high, I'll try to reduce a little bit. 500 feet, clear to land. Well, that's a false warning, we can ignore that. It's a bit windy. There we go. That was a firm landing, I have to say. There we go. And we have touchdown. And now we can come to a full stop. Now this is not really a landing tutorial, so I'm just going to give you one more tip. You know, when you've landed, make sure that you vacate the runway nice and quickly, because there may be traffic behind you. Again, just make sure that you manage the situation with the other traffic as well. So if you know that there's an aircraft behind you, make sure that you actually vacate the runway on time. Okay, don't just let the aircraft roll all the way to the end when it's not necessary, right? So there we go, we vacated the runway, and now we can just taxi to the gate depending on what instructions the ground controller gives us.
Now I hope you enjoyed this arrival at Prague. Now I hope that this video has really helped you to kind of make you more aware of the different situations that may occur and how to deal with those situations, and that it kind of helps you to deal and tackle different arrival situations at different airports, because let's face it, each and every airport is really different, so you have to keep that in mind. No one standard terminal arrival route is the same, and no one traffic situation is the same. So I really hope this video gives you kind of a more complete picture on how to deal with the descent phase. And by the way, if you want to check out some tips on how to stress less during this phase, make sure you check out my video from last week's with some tips to control your nerves while flying on VATSIM. So I'd like to thank you for watching this video here on the Aviation Pro channel. Make sure you check out some of my other content, and if you appreciated this tutorial, please consider becoming my patron over at patreon.com/aviationpro. Your help would be much appreciated. For now, I'd like to thank you for watching. I wish you good luck on your flights on VATSIM, and I will see you next time.